the living Word. When communicating the message of salvation, words, ideas, and concepts should be used that help listeners clearly understand God's eternal and never-changing truth. Here's Gene.
The Apostle John actually practiced this principle when he wrote the Gospel of John. And we see it right in the very first verse of the Gospel when he uses the word, the Greek word, logos. And here's what John wrote, verse 1, chapter 1, the Gospel of John. I've called it the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, that is, the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In other words, he is saying in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Now what's happening here is John is writing to a universal audience. When the Jewish audience would read these words, they would immediately think, if they knew and understood the Old Testament, that this word logos is used in the Septuagint. The Septuagint, by the way, was a Greek translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And the word logos is used in that translation. For example, when you look at Psalm 147, verse 15, we read this: He, that is God, sends His command throughout the earth. His word, His logos, runs swiftly. Now, Jews would understand, and that's just one illustration, they would understand that this word is a personification of deity. But they also understand it's a metaphor, because the logos, the word, is running swiftly. What it's simply saying, it's present, it's moving, it's there, it's reality, it's dynamic. So the Jewish audience would understand that word when John said that the Logos was in the beginning. But you see, the pagan audience, the Gentile audience, particularly the philosophers of the Greek world, would understand that word. However, their definition would be totally different than what John actually meant. Because in the Greek world of that time, among the philosophers, the word logos referred to ultimate intelligence, whatever that is. But they recognized there must be an ultimate intelligence. Or another way they would express it is a controlling reason of the universe. In other words, these philosophers were discussing what they believed was at least a universal principle. Now, they were not thinking, when they heard the word logos or read it, they were not thinking of an all-knowing, all-powerful, and ever-present personality, God Himself. I remember when I was studying at New York University working on my PhD, I had a discussion with my primary professor. She was a lovely lady, and we had great communication. But I remember one time asking her, "Do you believe in a God?" And I'll never forget her response. "I believe in a God, but I believe it's some kind of universal principle, probably." In essence, this is what she said. It was a philosophical perspective. God is no doubt some universal principle, and she probably would have put the word God, she'd have used a lowercase g, because she wouldn't think of a God as we think of God as an ever-present, all-powerful personality. Now, John is referring to that concept of God when he says here in this particular introduction, right from the very beginning, and let me just reread this again. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, it's interesting that a short time before Jesus was crucified, he was in the upper room. He was having a conversation, an intense conversation in some respects, about what was going to happen. And he said, I'm going to go away, but I'll come again. I'm going away to prepare a house for you. But don't let your hearts be troubled about this. Now, Thomas was very, very confused. And this is what he said there in the upper room. Now, remember, this is a short time before Christ's death. There in the upper room when they're having the Passover meal. Lord, Thomas said, we don't know where you're going. Now, he told them that he was going away, but he was really confused. How can we know the way because we don't even know where you're going? And Jesus told him, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. And these are the words he said to Thomas, and notice his next words. If you know me, you will also know my Father. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. That is, when you see me, you see the Father. In essence, I and the Father are one. And that's what John was referring to in this passage of Scripture. Now, Philip was there, and he was confused as well. And notice what Philip said. Lord, Lord, said Philip, show us the Father. Now, he just didn't hear what Jesus had said. Otherwise, he would have said, wow, you are the Father. But what he said was, show us the Father. And that's enough for us. And Jesus said to him, have I been among you all this time and you do not know me, Philip? I am the Father. That's what he's saying. And so he goes on. The one who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? You see, when John introduced that, he said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Doesn't say he was a God. There's one Bible translation that tries to make the Greeks say it was that Jesus was a God. Didn't say that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. It's an incredible statement. It's just awesome, that statement, that concept. Now, it's important to understand that what John is doing here is he's using the freedom of language to communicate a truth. And he's not mixing truth with error. When you mix truth with error, it's called syncretism. And we see this happening. It happened in the Old Testament. For example, when they're at the foot of Mount Sinai and they crafted this golden calf, they were not replacing God. They were simply saying, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. Now, there's a difference in worshiping Baal and the other gods, the false deities, but what they were doing was taking and making an image of God. And that's why, by the way, in the Old Testament commandments, it says you should not make any graven image and say that that represents me or that is me. So you see, there was syncretism. Now later, Ahab, remember, began to worship the Baals. That was not syncretism. That was just pure idolatry. There's another story in Judges, and you see syncretism on the part of the religious people, Judaism, throughout Chronicles, throughout Judges, because everybody did that was right in their own eyes. And by the way, here's the principle that I take from this, and I call it religious syncretism. We must be extremely cautious that we never combine pagan concepts with true biblical values. And there's a story of a man by the name of Micah, Judges chapter 17. And in this particular story, his mother gives him some silver, and he gives it back to her, and she goes to a person who molds it into a an image, and he sets it up in his house. And there's a young man, a Levite, comes along. He invites him into his house and said, "You're my high priest. I'm so glad you're in my house." And it's basically, the story says, there were all these images. And they were worshiping the images, but these images were made to represent God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's syncretism. And we should never syncretize. You've heard me share the story. You go to South America particularly, where the religious system, Christianity, as it is presented, is syncretized with Spiritism. You can actually see idolatry mixing in with Christianity. That's syncretism. And that's wrong. By the way, one of the justifications for doing that is you can get more converts if you let them bring their pagan beliefs into Christianity. That's syncretism. And John is not guilty here of syncretism. And so let me explain what that really means. John was explaining, when he says, "In the beginning was the Word," and he uses the word logos, he is using the freedom that God gave him with language to communicate that the Word, the logos, is indeed a philosophy that states, and a theology that states, that Jesus Christ is God. And he became flesh and dwelt among us in the person of Jesus Christ. No syncretism, just using the word so Jews would understand and move them into truth, so the Greeks would understand to move into truth, to understand what Jesus said. "I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life," as he said there to Thomas in John chapter 14. Here's a reflection and response question. How does Paul's goal for communicating the gospel verify that we have freedom in form, even in the use of language? And that's what John is doing. He's using the freedom of form in language. Language is form to express truth. Now notice what he wrote to the Corinthians. This is Paul's methodology, and it's important to understand that John was using methodology when he used the word logos to communicate a biblical truth. He's using language. And so Paul later said, "To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win Jews." Now, when he said that, was Paul saying, "I decided to compromise what I believe about Jesus Christ and who he is"? No. No. He goes on to say, "To those who are without the law," that's us, that's Gentiles, most of us, "I became like one without the law, to win those without the law." Does that mean that Paul began to live like pagans in order to get them to listen to him, engaging in their sinful practices? No. He simply said, and here is a summary, really, of what John was doing. "I have become all things to all people, so that I may by every possible means save some." And the key word there is by every possible means. No compromise of who Jesus is. There were times, for example, when Paul, when he was in Jerusalem, had his hair cut in order to relate to those who were Jews and didn't know the Messiah. But at that moment, you would say to Paul, "Hair doesn't, why did you do that?" He would say to you, "What I do in cutting my hair has absolutely nothing to do. It's just a cultural practice, and if I do that, knowing that I was a former rabbi, that they might listen to what I say." When the Jews were critical of Timothy, because he was born really in a mixed marriage. His father was a pagan, his mother was Jewish, and he was never circumcised according to the law. And so as they were traveling together, Paul had him circumcised, simply to relate or remove criticism so they'd listen to the gospel. You ask Paul, what does circumcision have to do with the gospel? It had absolutely nothing. In fact, that's what he said. That's a Jewish practice, has nothing to do with the gospel of Jesus. What I'm simply saying is that Paul never, ever compromised truth in order to communicate the gospel. And so we have this principle that comes right from John. When communicating the message of salvation, words, ideas, and concepts should be used that help listeners clearly understand God's eternal and never changing truth.